Hi there, my name is Miriam Morrill, and I am really excited to talk to you about one of my favorite things, and that is nature journaling, the fire environment. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. I have spent most of my life in California, where I spent the first half of my career as a wildlife biologist and collateral duty firefighter. I later moved into state and regional fire planning, prevention, and education program management. And part of that work was to support national wildfire response and occasional international fire education and planning efforts. So before I go into nature journaling the fire environment, let me first talk a little bit about just some of the basics about nature journaling. So really, this is your personal record of observations. It's a little bit like a diary, but you're putting the things that you see and experience in nature, and it's really focused on observations. And in recording those observations in your journal, you're wanting to find ways to engage your brain. And this nature journaling guru, John Muir Laws, he has several books and lots of workshops that are really fantastic and go over how to most actively engage your brain. And he recommends that you use a combination of words, numbers, and pictures. And by using those combination of different languages, visual languages, you're able to better activate different parts of your brain. So you want to use those words, numbers, pictures. Also having some prompts to help you make your observations more deeply. And he recommends there's I notice, so you're looking at something. I wonder, you're asking questions. And it reminds me of your kind of networking things to other things you've seen and known. And then lastly, I want to mention that your observations, you're out in the field, you're doing something, and you have multiple sensory inputs. So engaging all of your senses and using that to record your observations, all a very powerful system. So let me talk to you about nature journaling the fire environment. It really is a different approach than just your typical nature journaling. In nature journaling, you're looking at something, you're looking at an animal or a plant, and you're out there and you're looking at it differently, thinking about it differently. And fire is not an object, it's not an element, it's a chemical reaction on one level. And so how do you look at this chemical reaction? How do you observe this sort of thing? For one, it's part of the ingredients. The ingredients of fire may be oxygen, heat, and fuel, but our observations are more than just that process. We're also thinking about fire on the landscape and how it moves. And to do that, throughout your journaling process and journaling the fire environment, we're wanting to look at fire before, during, and after it occurs in the landscape, and we're wanting to look at the key aspects of the fire behavior triangle. This we can tie in at every phase of a fire. And the key aspects of the fire behavior triangle are topography, weather, and fuels. So I mentioned the fire behavior triangle and the key elements of that you should always try to integrate in your fire journaling, but I want to just give you this diagram, kind of looking at the big picture systems way of thinking about the fire environment and journaling. So, journaling is being in the field and making observations. And so how is it you can connect more of the scientific information and this ecosystem function, something bigger related to fire, and how do you tie that all in? And I look at it as I have these big scale observations I call expanded observations, where I'm looking at the big picture and not only topography, but thinking about how these terrain driven winds influence fire behavior and topography and all of these things. And I'm looking at that expanded scale before, during, and after fire. So I'm kind of looking big picture at fire through time. I'm also looking at the scene scale where I'm out there in nature and I want to look at things in a collective way. So looking at a grassland as a whole, a forest, and how fire behaves in that landscape before, during, and after. And I'm also making close observations, so kind of zooming in and focusing on an individual element and tying that in. And throughout each of these phases and these different observation scales, I'm looking at the fire behavior triangle. So before I go out into the field and do any nature journaling, I usually do a little bit of pre-work, and I find that that is easier and makes my experience better, especially if I want to journal something as complex as the fire environment. And this is an example of some journal pages I did for this lecture in a place where I was staying in Arizona for the winter. And basically, I kind of think about what I want to journal, and then I kind of design my pages for some of the key information I want to remember when I'm out there. One thing, when you get out into the field, there are so many neat things and you can get distracted, and you can certainly have fun journaling anything and everything, but I want to capture some key information. So I organize my page in a way where I think the information will flow, and also create some small little boxes so that I don't try to take on too much of a large sketch or drawing. So I kind of organize and design my page first and then do a little research. So in these nature journal templates for fire journaling, I typically do some of the overall land area, the topography, the location, that type of information that I will put on there. I have some stencils of the United States and some other stencils that I can use for really quick and standardized size on my page if that's something I want to do. And so I'll put that basic information that I researched about the area and create a little sketch area, a box there for the topographic sketch I plan to do in the field. And then I also do a mix of I kind of step down to more of a scene level sketch instead of that big picture look at the landscape, and I do some of the fuels sketches, and so I'll have something for horizontal fuels and vertical fuels. So I kind of think of the space I'll need for that and kind of pre-organize that information. And other elements that I include in my fire journal template that I set up before I go out is a lot around the weather, and not just the weather forecasted for the day, but I also like to have the season and the climate, because I'm wanting to get a feeling of change and how extreme conditions may be in context of the season and the overall climate. So I'll do a little research and I will include that range of temperature and moisture within not only forecasted, but within the season that I'm going out and within the larger sort of context, because all of these plants and animals and fire are completely intertwined with climate and weather. And so I like to have that comparison in my journal. Hello, it's me. I am out in the field now to do some nature journaling, the fire environment. And I picked a spot where I thought you could assess potential fire behavior. So you want to find a spot where you think there's enough vegetation and it's somewhat representative of the area, but also where you have a bit of a view of any of the topography. So I picked this spot and I am going to show you a few things. Obviously I have my journal, my paper. This one's a little big. I have some smaller ones that I really like, but I'm creating a bigger one so that I can photograph it and share what I've done on it. It'll be easier to see. I have several different nature journal kits, but I really like a really small one. This has a little band And I have a few pens, a pencil, a water brush for painting, a mechanical pencil, and a small watercolor set. So this is my like standby, just grab and go kind of stuff. So I like a small watercolor set that I can fit in here and carry all of this. This is a viewfinder. You don't have to have this, but it's helpful to narrow down and kind of frame what it is you want to be journaling. You can also just use your hands and kind of frame in a scene that way. So, but this is something else you can make, or you can buy one of these viewfinders. And that's the core of what I have out here. Plus I'm sitting on a little folding chair, very light. You can stand, a lot of people stand for quick journaling. If you're going to stay somewhere for a while, it's nice to have some kind of little light chair that you can bring with you. So that is the core of what I have come out here with. This thing on my wrist is for wiping off my paintbrush. What's handy is to cut your old socks and use that, and it's on your wrist so you don't drop it and you have that with you. So that is the nature journaling kit stuff that I have. Okay, so I'm kind of looking around the area where I'm at. Again, I'm looking for something somewhat representative, and yet there's enough vegetation. And I'm actually in the Arizona desert, about 45 minutes from Tucson, south of Tucson. And there's a lot of open, dry areas, but there's also patches of and sometimes extensive grasslands intermixed. And what I'm looking for in my first sketch is I like to do a landscape sketch, a very small one in my journal. And for fire, I am looking for a combination of the terrain, the shape of the land, with a little bit of the shape of the vegetation around me. And this is going to be a simple, small sketch. And I'm kind of looking out that direction. And here's my viewfinder. Zoom in on that. You could see kind of how I'm framing a little selection, and I'm picking that area because it has there's some little rolling hills here, and there are further out, maybe I need to go over there, some pretty mountainous areas a little further up, and I'm not necessarily going to be right here experiencing that fire behavior, but a lot of the fires do occur up there. And so it could start down here and go up, or it could start up there and spread down. So here is my beginning landscape sketch. Super basic. This is a very small sketch. And what I'm trying to do first, I use a pencil and I just sketch in the shape of the mountains, some lines covering some of the different elevational areas or the vegetation patches. So very simple sketch. Once I have my pencil sketch, then I can come back in with some watercolors, and I have a very small watercolor field kit, so I don't have a ton of selection, but I'm really just trying to capture the just basic foundational colors for the background of this. And then after I've done a pencil sketch and my watercolors, then I go over it with a pen, a dark pen, mostly so it's some of the things that I want to stand out can stand out, or having some cleaner lines. Sometimes I'll come back with more detailed painting or colored pencils, but for this purposes of this, I just wanted to get a feel of topography of landscape of the back mountains, the rolling hills, and the flat grassland I'm in. Another thing to be looking at when you're out here journaling the fire environment is to look at the weather. And I usually try to get the high, middle, and low cloud zones so that I can see if there are any differences in how clouds are moving and what that could mean for the wind. But today there's not a whole lot of wind and there's a lot of moisture, so you can see all the clouds and the moisture. And so this would be a scene, something I would be sketching in my journal are the cloud behaviors, and then putting notes about what the moisture and winds are doing. So the journal sketch that I do for the sky and the atmosphere is in this column I have on the right of the page, and I am just looking for some of the simple shapes of the clouds. I want to get an idea of movement, of if they're moving between the cloud zones, and how it might be intersecting with the land. So I like to start with a very simple pencil sketch. You could just throw watercolors or draw that in another way, or you might just write a bunch of notes in that space, but I have this as part of my standard column for this information. And you can see here where I have added my watercolors to my little pencil sketch. I don't feel like I got the clouds or anything the way I would have liked. I might have, if I had a tissue with me, I might have blotched out some of the color to give a better cloud look. But it got what I needed, and that was a space where I could also add some of my notes about what was going on in the sky and with the clouds. So I want to show you a little bit more on an expanded view of the sky. And although you can't even see the sky in this illustration I did, it's a large block landscape. And this type of sketch or illustration can show you how the wind interacts with the landscape. And so I find it really helpful if I'm doing something focused more at this expanded scale and topography and winds, looking at where the prevailing wind is coming from and putting that on your landscape. And then also the terrain-driven winds that come in, which there are seasonal winds that can come in over the terrain, but there are also daily winds of upslope and downslope, up valley, down valley, that are based on how the sun is warming different sides of the landscape. And so if you know that and you've put that in your journal, you'll have an idea of if a fire starts, which direction might the fire move based on these winds. And in this illustration of mine, I'm showing some of the atmospheric indicators that are for actual firefighters for their situational awareness. They list this in the U.S. for when you're out fighting fire, the things to look for that mean change, and those changes that influence winds. And so whether it's an inversion, and knowing that once that inversion breaks, you're going to have some changes in winds. If you have certain clouds, thunderstorms, things coming in, paying attention to those, because those are indications of changes in weather and the winds, which influence fire significantly. So looking for those, learning those, and looking for what are some indicators of changing weather and shifting winds. One of the other big things that you want to look at for your fire environment journaling is the horizontal arrangement and continuity of fuels. So looking around, and you'll want to do a little bird's eye view sketch or diagram of how the vegetation is sort of organized out there and how they're all connected. And so I'm looking at the amount of grass versus bare ground and the shrubs and other things in the landscape. So you're looking at these horizontal fuels, and I'll show you some examples of how that ends up looking. You're also wanting to look at what we call your ladder fuels or your vertical arrangement of fuels. And although the primary fire is carried on the surface, it can move up into trees versus through what's called the ladder fuels. And so looking at where do the grasses or the shrubs connect with the trees and low branches, and how does it move up into shrubs and trees. And so here out in the desert, in this spot, there are spots where there's a lot of dry grass materials and low branches. And so this becomes a bit of a ladder fuel. The low shrubs are still surface fuels. So when you're looking at these little things here, these little shrubs, those are still part of your surface fuels. But you do want to look around and see where is that grass or those low materials, where is it reaching the higher up layers of vegetation. So now we're at those scene scale observations and sketches. And I had pre-created in my journal page before I went out this space where I wanted to be able to sketch the
horizontal fuel arrangement, and that is looking at the mix of both ground vegetation and other things in there, but how they are next to each other and how contiguous that is across that area. And so I have a little symbol, this big swirl for a tree, little circles for shrubs, and I actually just created little patches of where it's barren ground. The rest of the area I'll color in. And then I have my vertical fuel arrangement for those ladder fuels, where I'm showing where the grass connects to the shrub, connects to a tree. And so both horizontal and vertical fuel arrangement is important. You could certainly make either one of those more realistic or more symbolic, because really what you want to see is how they're arranged and connected. And here you see those same sketches colored in and with some ink over the top. I do think color on these is pretty important, because not only are you looking at the arrangement of vegetation, you're looking at the condition. And for fire, obviously, the drier that vegetation is, the more of concern. And so trying to symbolize this visually and write it in your notes can be really important. And so on my horizontal fuels especially, you can see almost all of the grass is really dry. And, you know, if it would have been a different time of year, maybe I would have patches of green. And here I just wanted to show you, I hadn't really mentioned the type of pen I use. I use lots of different pens. This particular one I'm showing you is what's called a brush pen, and the tip of it is like a paintbrush, although it has ink on the inside. And I like to use this for a lot of my plants. It gives kind of an artistic look, and I can create really thick lines or really thin lines, and so that's kind of nice for sketches. So these are some of the things that I really want to focus on in fire. We're looking at fuels, and that's the vegetation. And fire primarily starts and moves on the ground, on the surface. And so you want to look at what kind of, they call it carrying fuels. So what is here that is like kindling, that is going to start a fire? And we have these dry grasses. You might be able to hear how crackly they are. Also low-lying shrubs with little dry flower heads here. And so these are the things that I want to look closely at. I want to get a sense of how dry, the shape and the size of them, and then how continuous they are. So in this little sketch you see here, I'm looking closely at some of those fine fuels, the kindling, the carrying fuels that I'm looking at. And you can hold it right next to you. You can trace around the edges of it. You could even potentially dip it into some paint and get an imprint. But capturing some of that information, especially the size and shape for the fine fuels, you're looking at if there's more surface area to volume, the more flammable it'll be. And here you see my fine fuels, my close-up observations, colored in and inked in. The two things that I had really noticed that seemed really dry were those little bush flower heads and stems, very dry, and the grasses on the ground. And one thing I'd love to do at the close-up scale is to use my senses, because there are some things that you can't necessarily see that relate to fire that you can notice by touching and smelling. And one neat little tidbit, a lot of fire practitioners, the prescribed fire managers, people implementing fire, they will often go out and grab a handful of pine needles or grass, and if those materials bend, even if they're dry and dead, but if they bend, there's enough air moisture that those fuels are going to have trouble igniting. Whereas if they crack and crumple in your hands, they're really dry and really flammable. And so being able to write those senses down of what it feels like, what it smells like is different. You can even do this over an entire season of going out and checking the same grasses and fine-tuning those Are there subtle differences in the way they touch and feel that you'd know if that fire season was coming in just by walking through and smelling and touching things? So it's really fun to do these deep sensory close observations. I highly recommend doing that. So I'd like to mention that you may not have opportunities to actually see fire if you're out at a prescribed fire, safely watching a wildfire, or if you're just doing your own little studies somewhere safe. But should always look to find out if there are any local fire restrictions and make sure you're in a safe place to do that. So, but if you can integrate a little bit of lighting a couple leaves or grass on fire safely, it could really give you some interesting information to add to your nature journal. So I've moved over into a really dry spot because I want to light a few little of those fine fuels, those small kindling type vegetation materials, and look and see how it burns. And I don't want to do that where I'm in the dry grass. So if you're in pavement or somewhere where it's all barren is where you want to do this. You do not want to do this in a dry area with lots of vegetation around. And you could even potentially do this in a classroom or somewhere where you have all these safety measures set in place. Now I'm going to light a few little materials on fire, and you want to look at how quickly they ignite. You can also look at the type of smoke. Sometimes it's more of a steam when it's just drying, but these are very, very dry. And these burn very quickly. So you can see on the center and right of this journal page, I tried to sketch with my pencil the shape of the flames as it burned across the grass. I'm more interested in the shape and kind of the flame length and that sort of thing. So I first created my little flame sketch. And then you can see here where I have colored it in. And I would say that the flame color is not as accurate as the actual flames that I was looking at. The actual flames were very thin and wispy and very see-through. I didn't have that many different paints with me and didn't spend a lot of time trying to make it a super accurate flame color. I was looking at the movement. I also added my ink on this, but only where the grass stems charred because I wanted that to jump out. So those were a couple things I accented here. And then I was also paying attention to how quickly those flames burned. One quick thing I will mention about color is that flame color can indicate temperature, and typically the white, the bright yellows, that's a hotter area of where the combustion process is happening. And then as the flame cools, it becomes more orange and red. Other things can influence color, but color does have some meaning. In my flame observation, it was very quick, so I really couldn't do a whole lot of other in-depth flame observations. But you can learn about flame anatomy and flame measurements. They have a flame length and a flame height, and they could be different if the wind is blowing or some other influence is pushing the flames in a particular direction. That lean is the flame length, and so that's one observation. Also looking at where the flame is attached to the fuels. Some flames you may see on the vertical side of grass coming up or on a tree. Others may just be on the ground, on the grass, but that flame attachment area where combustion is actually occurring. There's also what's called an intermittent attachment area where the flames are bumping against and preheating it and sometimes starting little spots of fire, and so that's an intermittent area. That, if you know about combustion, there's a process before it called pyrolysis where things are drying out enough that combustion can occur. And so that intermittent and lifted flame area is a place where you can make observations about pyrolysis where the flame actually burning would be your combustion process area. So looking for those things can be interesting measurements to include in your nature journal. Besides your flame observations, you can also be looking at smoke, and you can look at smoke at all your different observation scales, from expanded, where you're looking at smoke coming off a landscape, a big fire up in the distance, just overall smoke in the air, and you can be looking at the differences of how different the color or how thick the smoke is in an area where pyrolysis is occurring or where combustion is occurring. Lots of interesting smoke observations. If you are observing something bigger than just a small flame, you could also be learning about fire anatomy, that an overall fire area, usually in a wildfire, has names to the different parts of it, and where the wind is blowing it, and where you have the most intensity is usually the head or the front of the fire, and then you have the flanks of the fire, the side areas of it, and you have a heel or back area. And that whole area is growing. Fire is expanding outwise, but the head of it is where the overall momentum, where most of the fire will be moving in that direction. And so looking at these different parts of a fire is something else you can learn and journal about. And within a fire area, you could be looking at fire behavior patterns, and there are really three kind of key fire behavior patterns that you look at. Advancing fire is where that head of the fire is, and advancing fire is when the wind is blowing the flames, and those flames are leaning forward and advancing in that direction. The flames and the wind are pushing in that same direction, whereas the opposite on the backside, the backing fire, is where flames are, the fire's moving against the wind. So you might see the flames leaning in towards the burn area, and it's the bottom area that's kind of creeping out and moving outwards. And lateral fire patterns can be a mix of both advancing and backing fires, but learning your fire behavior patterns can be really helpful in your journaling. If you ever have an opportunity to nature journal a prescribed fire, there are some prescribed burn anatomy and tactics terminology that you can learn. Basically, there's a burn unit. There are areas that are used as fuel breaks, and it may be a road or a trail, a river. Lots of different terminology you can learn about in prescribed fires and how they ignite them and burn them. Typically, they're trying approaches where they want either an advancing fire behavior or a backing fire behavior, sometimes a mix depending on that overall burn unit. So learning your prescribed fire anatomy can be helpful in those observations. You can also journal about how fast a fire is moving. I had done a little bit of research and found out that for your average, both backing and advancing fires, they move at about the speed of a tortoise or a sea turtle. So in the nature journaling that I did for this lecture, I did not have any after the fire observations included, but there certainly is a lot you can nature journal about after a fire occurs, and just the long time scale changes that you might be observing. So I'm going to share with you a few illustrations and some examples of things you can journal after a fire. So one of the fun things to use to nature journal after a fire is to learn about what's called fire pattern indicators. There are 11 of these fire pattern indicators, and they're used by wildland fire investigators that investigate the cause and origin of a fire. And these are things you can look at mostly right after a fire, a few weeks. Some of them you'll still see a few months, and maybe a very few of them you can see years later. And so these are things you can observe right away and over time. But an example is looking at the advancing or backing fire pattern indicators, and the angle of char, that dark area you see on a tree. If that has a really steep angle to it, that indicates the direction the fire was moving, the advancing fire. And if that char is parallel to the ground, that dark area, it indicates backing fire. And so being able to look at that on the landscape along with the scorch of the trees and the branches, they also have those angles that can indicate advancing and backing fire and which direction the fire was going. In addition to the fire pattern indicators, you can also learn how to frame your fire effects observations. And so the same things, you could be looking at how much of the tree was charred, how much of the crown of the tree, of those leaves, were scorched, and watching that over time. Many trees can survive a certain percentage of their leaves being burned, and some are very sensitive and might die. And so if you are observing over time, you can see if those trees are recovering or if they're going to die. You can also be looking for things like if there are any of the little terminal buds, the little leaf buds that are coming out, if some of those are still there, or maybe they were not burned, it was other leaves that were scorched, there's a better chance of that tree surviving. So looking really closely. You could also be looking to see if any of the cones on the tree are still there, if they came off, if they burned all the way. And a number of species need fire for those seeds to sprout, to open up and sprout. And so sometimes after a fire, you'll see that the cones were scorched, but they open up and all these fresh seeds are there ready to come out and be able to sprout over the next few years. And so looking for these observations. Another thing to look at when trees are stressed, whether it's from heat and insects, usually there's a combination of insects attacking trees when they're stressed, could be from a drought, but also fires. Looking at the sap, is the sap clear? Is it coming down? Is that tree stressed? The more sawdust type materials coming out of the tree, showing more insect attack, is not a good sign, and sometimes those pitch tubes are going to look red like blood, indicating pretty severe insect attacks. So kind of looking for that and watching the tree over time and seeing how it is shifting and changing related to fire. Sometimes you'll see some of these signs of tree mortality, especially from insect infestations when there's been a lack of needed fire, when fire's been suppressed or there's been a long period of drought. A couple of other things to think about after a fire, what you can journal. Looking at soil layers. Obviously, fire can have deep impacts on the soil or barely burn anything deep. And so digging in a little bit and looking and comparing an area where none of the fire burned with an area where it was more severely burned, and seeing what still remains down in the mineral layers. So taking a look at your soil layers, and also fire scars, those charred and burned areas on the outside of a tree. You may see some stumps or things in the area, or maybe somebody cut some wedges from a burned tree, and there are actual ways to find out how many different fires throughout that area over time occurred based on those fire scars within the tree rings. Very fun and interesting. So let me give you a few examples and kind of overarching thoughts on fire journaling, the environment, how you can journal this better. It's kind of thinking about how you visualize and think about all of these sorts of things. So let me give you some examples of that. So let me just start back with the basics for nature journaling, using words. Very important, and not just describing your observations, but the way you write your words, the font, the colors, how you display those can all be really interesting ways to accent and enhance what you're journaling about. So thinking about your words. Numbers, thinking about how to integrate numbers, not only counting the things, but measuring things in the fire environment. A lot of the measurements you use in fire are forestry and fire measurements, and you're kind of looking at tree diameters, tree heights. You're looking at slope, like the angle of slope. There are some really key points related to fire, such as a 20% slope has been shown to have a significant difference in fire behavior. So when you're measuring things, looking for that, integrating distance and learning things like how to pace your distance. So when you're walking, you can integrate measurements and distance, all these really interesting ways that can make it easy for you to build in numbers relevant to your nature journaling and fire journaling. The other way that numbers are super important and valuable in journaling about fire is how to use data graphs. I use them a lot in my journaling about a particular fire event, a wildfire. The information here was from the 2018 Camp Fire that burned the town of Paradise. But again, looking at your fire behavior triangle, you're looking at weather and topography and things. And within weather, you're looking at temperature, wind, and moisture. And so I separate those data points out for each day and compare them with the number of acres that burn that day. And I like to use these different spark lines or line graphs for my weather data, and I like a bar graph or a pie graph for my acres, but I especially like a bar graph where I can differentiate the acres that burned overnight and the acres that burned during the day and look at those with the weather. Super helpful, and other types of graphs, but data can be incorporated into graphs and be really powerful. So we talked about words, numbers, and of course pictures. Pictures are almost intuitive when it comes to nature journaling. We emphasize that a lot. But thinking about the types of visuals that you want to include, the types of pictures, maps, always very helpful. Different kinds of diagrams for whether you're trying to capture spatial information or temporal information. Also thinking about your overall page design, what kind of information you want to organize, like the template I used for the fire journaling for this exercise with you all, or some of my fire and climate graphs that I do monthly, tracking not only weather but other observations I see with that. Explore that. Find creative ways, things that are meaningful to you, things that seem to resonate and capture this visual information in your pictures. So now I am back to the journal pages I created here for you, and this template, this way to journal about the fire environment, I think is probably the more foundational, the basic critical elements to think about, and you could design your page completely different. I have mine set up in a specific way because I'm curious about weather. I have a lot of the weather on that top outside pages so I could flip through and see, okay, it was really hot, what observations did I see? So I'm color coding things and arranging things in ways that I can go back and find them. But here, the basics for your fire journaling: you want something with topography, a little landscape sketch that includes the topography. You should include information about elevation and aspect. That can be very different in the type of fire behavior, the type of fire regime, so including this background information. And then your fuels, you had topography fuels, looking at least at how they are horizontally and vertically arranged so that you could see how fire could move in the landscape. Looking at some of the fine fuels, those carrying fuels, think of them as the kindling that start and spread the fire. Looking those closely. If you can observe how those look and burn, do they burn quickly? You'll notice significant differences in that based on the seasons and just the relative humidity. Even the same season, you could have a very moist day, and those fine fuels are going to have very different ways they burn. So looking at that, and I think it's important to compare your weather for the season and for climate trends. So adding context and comparing those. So whether you have a few of these that you do with the background information in it, or if you create one big background section and then do your regular ongoing journaling differently. But it's very important to compare the context of the weather to topography and to fuels and within the season and over time. So here in these illustrations of mine, the sense of space in fire journaling is important. Where you are, what you're looking at, that scale, whether you're expanded scale or at a scene, but thinking visually and thinking about how fire and how you can integrate the fire behavior triangle in your information. So block diagrams, vertical and horizontal diagrams, I think are very, very helpful to integrate when you want to relate fire. Thinking of scale and size, I often have a little person inside of my sketches to give a visual context to how tall, how thick vegetation is, and then I have my horizontal and vertical diagrams for that spatial scale, distance, adding information about distance, air quality, atmospheric conditions, smoke. Again, spatially looking at those, having a different high, middle, low cloud levels, seeing how clouds move between those levels, seeing how air pressure affects wind at different areas, different spatial scale visuals. Super, super helpful in fire journaling. The other thing I think that's really important to think about in your fire journaling is that sense of time. How are you integrating that? It can be kind of challenging, but I personally love to use circles and gears visually in my journaling to convey that fire being a part of this succession of a vegetation community, these ecosystem ecological changes. I really like to use these gear diagrams like I have in the upper left and sketching some of the visual elements in there. And you could make this a very artistic thing or very simple like this is. I also have done a lot of the what I call a fire weather wheel in the upper right there, where this is my monthly composite visual here, and I have in the circle, I have two rings. The outer ring, you can't see looking at this here, but there's a little square within each of those rings that represent each day. You could actually make this like a pie with little narrow wedges. So there's a single little piece for each day, and that becomes an entire ring for the month. And the outer one is the daytime high temperatures, and the inner one is the nighttime low temperatures, because for fire, I'm interested in the best and worst case scenarios of fire behavior, of that kind of the benchmarks for fire weather. And so I have a color code, which I'm coloring each of those little blocks in there. That represents what that feels like to me based on where you are. And so I can't read it from here, but I have a temperature range of what seems hot to me. So if I'm walking around and I'm journaling, I don't necessarily have to know the super exact temperature, but it feels hot to me. So I know it's between at 90 and 100 or 80 and 100. So I have a color code for my temperatures, and I put that in for my journaling so I can look at it and get a feel for how hot it is. I have codes for wind and moisture as well that I include in there. So all interesting things to think about and look at over time. And my bottom graph there is an illustration, maybe a little more complicated than you'd normally want, but what I'm wanting to show you is thinking about a way to demonstrate time. And so I have different blocks of a week, and this is a prescribed fire. I had a different illustration of wildfire comparing smoke within those blocks. And so I'm looking at a spatial and temporal element. How do you visualize that? And whether you have different kinds of diagrams with different blocks of time, super helpful in journaling about the fire environment. In this collage, I am sharing some of my artwork over the years. And I think another thing when you're journaling about fire, it's not just the environmental elements you're journaling. You have emotional connections to it. And I think it's valuable to journal about how you feel, what comes out of those experiences. And I've had times working in fire where maybe there was a big fire like the one I have in the upper left here that I was watching from the news and I wasn't able to support firefighting efforts, and I felt very helpless. And so I wanted to kind of capture that information and write a little bit of my feelings or poetry. So I do some expression type artwork. I also like to try to symbolize recovery and that feeling of little small things that need to be highlighted in a kind of dark environment, or how I'm feeling coming out of taking on a big challenge and that emergence from that situation. Or maybe I'm journaling about animals interacting in the fire environment, like I have on the bottom left with a bird scratching around looking for insects that died in the fire. Our influence on fire. I have illustrations where a little sprout is coming out of the flames, representing benefits of fire environments, or our imprint on the fire environment. How do you visualize that? It can be very fun and creative things to approach about fire and how you feel connected. And I'd like to end on emphasizing our senses again. I feel like our sense of place really connects all of our sensory inputs of how we connect to that. And fire is a part of many of our landscapes. And so connecting ourselves, our whole body and whole mind to observations, I think is so valuable, but such a pleasure and a joy. But how do you journal that? How do you put that in your journal? And I've explored a number of ways, and I have just a few examples here, but you can have a picture of somebody, of yourself doing the thing that you're listening, or you're smelling something. That can be a little more of a challenge, but if you're wanting practice drawing people, that's kind of fun to do. You don't have to have a very realistic picture. But also, how do you visually show different sounds? Are you doing at different scales? Are you doing little designs or dots or colors? How do you associate sounds? How do you visualize scents? I like to use colors. I think they really seem meaningful, also kind of represent the things that are, if I'm seeing green vegetation versus dry vegetation. But there are lots of interesting ways to do that over maps and things. And fire specifically, there's been research out there talking about how you can actually, well, humans can't hear it exactly, but technology can be used, but we can hear a certain range of the sounds that happen in fire, and there's a difference between the different species of trees burning, the different age groups. You can even have a different sound signature for drought-stressed trees versus well-watered trees, and so there's interesting sound signatures associated with fire, the different kinds of pops and crackles and different scents. So many other senses to integrate about the fire environment. Temperature, touch, texture. How do you visualize that and describe it? You can create your own little library of information, of different terms you like to use. Super fun, super interesting, and really helpful in developing your observation skills. I hope that I have given you enough background and some highlights and steps and examples of how to nature journal the fire environment. I will mention that I do have a website called Pyrosketchology. I also have a Facebook page, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and I try to share some of what I'm doing and where I see other people nature journaling and illustrating about fire. So you can go and explore my website if you'd like more information, and I hope you have enjoyed this. Thank you.